95, 96% of beer is water. And so for me, the most important ingredient that we can have in our beer making process is the water. Our water here in Western North Carolina has a really, really good mineral composition, and so that's why a lot of bigger breweries are moving to this area, and why the industry is really taking off in this area. Our water is easily manipulable if we want to change it in any way, but it's just a really good base water, but it's also just good. It's just so tasty. Most people in big cities can't just open their tap and get a nice drink of water. Where here, people might complain like, "Oh, this water tastes so crappy," but the water here is just fantastic quality. And so what we have here is just a simple filtration system. That's all we have in filtering our water and what we use to make beer. And so basically, there's just 3 filters. 2 are a particular size and 1 is a different size. And once the water cycles through that to get rid of, the only thing that we're looking to get rid of is chlorine and fluoride. If there is trace calcium in it, if there's trace zinc in it, that's actually what makes the water here so good, is that it has those minerals in it, which is great for yeast nutrient, and it adds to the overall flavor of our beer making process. So once our water comes in to the tanks, we basically heat it up to about 180, 185 degrees to kill off any crap that's in it, and to get it ready for mashing. And when we mash, we will have anywhere between, I think, 350 and 750 pounds of grain will go in our mash tun. And there is where we're going to get the base of the beer, which once the water is added to the grain in here, it now becomes wort. And so now the wort is going to pick up all the sugars and proteins we're going to use during fermentation after they've been broken down by the boil. Here is where you're going to pick up the base flavors. That's where the sort of grain flavor of beer comes in. If you were to have darker grains, that would be like the porters and the stouts and stuff. Any kind of middle of the road grain is going to add usually some kind of burnt sugar, raisiny. Some people talk about beer being more bready, nutty, and those flavors aren't actually from any kind of flavoring added to the beer. It really just comes from the grain itself. The reason it's called chocolate malt that one of the grain makers makes is that that grain will literally impart chocolate flavor into the beer. It's not like it's kind of chocolatey and then we flavor it later on. That's strictly just from the grain that we use. And so the grains that we use are American grains, and so they're highly modified, which means that we don't have to worry about there being extra proteins or being any kind of extra just element of the grain profile that would hinder basically using the process that we use to make beer any differently. When you get into certain German grains and Belgian grains, they treat their grain differently before the brewer gets it, and so it's important to know what goes into making that. But once we have all of the sugar and malty goodness, we pump it into the brew kettle. And once it gets into the brew kettle, then we will add the hops to it. The earlier on that we add hops to our wort at this point, the more bitter it will be. If we add the hops in towards the end of the boil, that will be strictly for aromatics and flavor that the hops leave in our beer. We use a variety of different hops depending on the style. Your IPAs are going to be different from your stouts. Your rye ale is going to be different from any other beer. And so the hops that are chosen are selected based on the flavors that they will leave in the wort. And so other than using hops, you can use other spices and things like that to add to the overall flavor of the beer. And in one of our beers, in our Clockwork Sneaky, we use coriander seed. This is going to add a lot of spice. The aromatics on this are going to be really, really great. And this is going to be used towards the end of the boil, because we're worried about this adding to the flavor and the aromatics and not necessarily the bitterness. And so we also use sweet orange peel. This again is similar. We're going to add this because we want to get the end aromatics and the end flavor in our beer. And so we will use these two for the Clockwork Sneaky. And any other variation of spice, we will sometimes use cinnamon sticks if we're wanting to make a holiday beer. You can use heather tips. You can use rose petals, anise, which is it adds like a licorice kind of flavor to it. But the beer that we make here is pretty simple. There aren't a lot of adjunct grains or special grains that we use. We don't really use any other spices other than what we use for the Clockwork Sneaky. But the wort will be boiled with the hops and with the spices and everything, and then we will pump it over to the fermentation tanks. Once all of the flavors and goodness have been added from using the boil to get out the flavors that we want out of the hops and the spices, we're then left to yeast. And I always just kind of joke that yeast does whatever it wants to do, and you need to learn to respect that, because yeast, it just does whatever it wants, and we're left to just hope that it will just all work out and the yeast will do its job. I'm basically the head janitor. I just worry about making wort, and then the yeast is what is going to make the beer. Luckily for us, yeast has one of its byproducts of fermentation is alcohol, and the other is CO2. And we want to keep the alcohol and the CO2. The CO2 is going to help keep in all the flavors in the beer and will prevent oxygen from getting into the beer and ruining it. Too much dissolved oxygen in a beer, if left exposed, could really lead to off flavors. People talk about papery flavors, metallic flavors, things like that. And we want to avoid that as much as we can. And so once the yeast is pitched onto the wort, it now becomes beer. And the yeast will create a pretty large variety of different alcohols or esters. And it might create esters, diacetyl, and just a really big variety of different alcohols. And those different alcohols are what going to impart the flavor. So if I were to use American ale yeast, that American ale yeast is essentially just going to add a little bit of fruitiness, a little bit of maltiness to the beer. But if you have, say, a Belgian yeast, that will impart intense spicy flavor to the beer. If you were to add a Edinburgh yeast or an Irish yeast, it's going to add a lot more like butterscotch or like a little bit creamier of flavors, and that is strictly done through fermentation by the yeast. A lot of flavors that exist in the beer are done so through the natural processes of breaking the sugars apart in the boil and the yeast just doing its work. We really don't add any special flavors to anything that we have other than the cherry vanilla stout. And so any flavors that are imparted, we structure how we make the beer just around how we can maximize the amount of flavor while keeping it as simple as we can. And we want to keep out the adjunct grains, the crazy special grains, the frothing agents, and the chemicals that a lot of bigger companies use to keep their beer like hyper consistent. And so we were basically left to let the yeast do its thing, and once it finishes up, we will crash cool it, which will get out residual yeast and proteins, and then once it's filtered and put into the bright tank, that's the product that you can get and drink.